Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Haneen Sayed, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of LIFE. On behalf of LebNet and LIFE and our outreach partner ILMA, I welcome you to the 7th episode of the Engage and Act series. In this bi-weekly series, which we started on October 16, we have been highlighting the humanitarian crisis as it is unfolding in Lebanon and spotlighting the efforts of organizations working on the ground who are helping alleviate the impact of the war. To date, we heard from Minister Nasser Yassin, responsible for the government's national emergency plan, the Lebanese Red Cross, several active NGOs, life member initiatives, and last week from 3 inspiring school principals. All of these episodes are available on the Life YouTube platform if you missed them. Today, we are privileged to have with us Mr. Imran Riza, the UN Deputy Special Coordinator for Lebanon and UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, to talk to us about Lebanon's humanitarian and reconstruction priorities post-ceasefire. But before I introduce Imran and start our discussion, I'd like to present to our audience the Lebanon Education Emergency Fund, which LIFE, through its charitable arm Life Generation and in partnership with LebNet, launched last week. Since the beginning of the war in Lebanon, LIFE identified education as an urgent issue and conducted a rapid assessment of the crisis' impact on Lebanon's education sector, highlighting an urgent need for local level interventions. Coherent with the Ministry of Education's emergency plan, the idea is to support populations impacted by the war to ensure education continuity. The objective of the emergency fund is to support NGOs providing formal education to school-age students from impacted communities so that they do not incur another year of learning loss. Through the funds that we are raising, we will be supporting organizations with a proven track record, ensuring total transparency in the process and maximizing impact by providing 100% of the funds directly to the NGOs. Our campaign started on December 4th and will last for 12 weeks. Details are provided by my colleagues in the chat below, but also on the Life and the LebNet social media and websites. Now, turning to our speaker. Imran Riza brings over 35 years of international experience across the United Nations system, mainly in the field. He was in Syria as United Nations Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator from 2019 to 2020. Prior to this, he served in Lebanon as Deputy Head of Mission and Director of the Division of Political Affairs at UNIFIL. Before UNIFIL, Imran served as a regional representative to the GCC for UNHCR and also UNHCR representative for Jordan. With UNHCR, he's also served in Geneva, Sudan, Hong Kong, and Vietnam. So Imran brings really a global experience. He's also held positions in the World Food Programme in Rome and is senior advisor to the personal representative of the Secretary General for Lebanon, as well as with UNSCOL. So we're very honored to have you with us today, Imran. Welcome. So I'll start to ask you a few questions, but for our audience, you have a Q&A where you can put your questions, and I'll be picking them up along the way. So let me start, Imran. Today, we're actually exactly 2 weeks to the day since the ceasefire. And during this period, of course, much has happened in Lebanon, as well as, of course, in neighboring Syria, which on Sunday saw the fall of the 54-year dictatorship and 14 years of civil war. Can you give us an update on the humanitarian situation on the ground in Lebanon, especially that you've been touring the south and the southern suburbs? So what are you seeing right now in terms of the situation on the ground 2 weeks after the ceasefire?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I guess let's start with just these last 2 weeks, because I mean, if you think of it, 15 days ago, we were planning for a very different set of humanitarian needs. I think the first point is that nothing has reduced in terms of humanitarian needs. There's a very high level of humanitarian need. What's changed a little bit in the last 2 weeks is where people are. So up till 2 weeks ago, you had about 900,000 internally displaced persons, Lebanese, in the country. We had maybe about a little over 500,000 that had crossed the border. Most of those were Syrians that went across to Syria, but about a third of them were Lebanese. In the course of the first 2 days, actually, after the ceasefire, in the first day, there were about 300,000 people that moved back south mostly. And in the first 2-3 days, it came to a total of close to 600,000. And that's what we have right now. We have a lot of people that have returned to their cadasters of origin, but not to their homes, not to their, because many of the homes, of course, have been destroyed. And certainly there's a whole swath of area in the south, close to the blue line. It's something like 60 villages that have been declared not accessible by the IDF that's still there. And so we have a lot of people that will have to wait quite some time, either because they can't get back to their place of origin right now, or because it's been destroyed. And there is no home to go. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about later, I guess, reconstruction and the like. So there are huge humanitarian needs. Yeah, go ahead.
No, where are they in the meantime? I mean, where are they staying?
They are mostly staying, and in fact, let's go back 15 days. And what we were planning for at that point was trying to see how we assist the majority of the displaced who were with either in empty apartments or with host families or relatives and the communities and the like. It was when you had 900,000 displaced, only 200,000 were in collective shelters, the schools, etc. So and we were trying to do that. And now you have a situation where most of the collective shelters are empty. They have emptied. So the whole priority there, of course, is trying to make sure that they are functional as schools as soon as possible. That is an urgent requirement. What your fund is about, what you were talking about earlier. But most of those that have gone back are probably with relatives, friends, communities. Basically, they wanted to be close to their place of origin. So in a place like Nabatea, that had one of the biggest displacements from there, if we look at the numbers that have returned to Nabatea, there are actually more people than had left from Nabatea, because many of the people from places like Khiam and other places that they can't go, Marjayoun, they are all also now in Nabatea. The level of destruction, I think all of us have seen it on the news. I've been able to go down and take a look. I was in Nabatea last week. I was in Dahia yesterday. It's a massive level of destruction. But what's also happening right now with this move of people back, I mean, it is pretty impressive in 2 days, 3 days to have 600,000 people trying to go home so quickly, is that many of them are trying what they can to look for livelihoods, look for what can be done, what can be in the immediate term done. And of course, one of the big priorities there is debris removal, rubble removal. That is what you see everywhere in terms of the places that have been targeted and hit. And as you know, it's been throughout the country.
Thank you, Imran. So, in terms of immediate humanitarian needs, what would you say they are now, 2 weeks into the ceasefire?
The needs are a lot of them are the same. There a lot of them are the same as what we had before. So shelter, and meaning a lot of people now who have gone down. I mean, if when I was saying there's 60 to 70 villages where people cannot just access at all right now for security reasons, but also because a lot of them have just been destroyed. The ones that are just along the blue line there, I think it's probably about 120,000 people. So those are people that need to be sheltered somewhere. So the whole notion of what we were working on before, how to help people that are not in collective shelters, is an important one. You had Minister Yassin on before the ceasefire, I think, right? when you
Mhm.
spoke to
Of course, yeah.
and that is exactly what we were planning on and discussing. Now, post the ceasefire, the discussions that I've been having with him is, do we have transit facilities that we can try to set up in areas, municipal land, in areas that are close to people's homes? So basically in the areas that have been most hit, because basically people do want to be close to their homes.
Absolutely. So, okay, this brings us then to the funding or the financing of the humanitarian needs. At the Paris Donor Conference, there was around 800 million that was pledged for humanitarian and then 200 million for the LAF. Can you give us an update on how much of that has actually materialized and where is it going? Um,
I wish I could give you, good firm figures in terms of a lot of what was pledged has come in. I cannot at this moment. We are still working with donors. We're still trying to confirm not just the pledges, but make them into commitments and make them into transfers that people, that agencies and the like can actually use. The ask that we had in Paris was on the humanitarian front. It was a flash appeal, and it was for $426 million that we asked. In terms of that, about 32% of it has been received now. So that's about 136 million. But an equal amount is committed, is pledged, that we're quite confident we will get. But that's still much less than the 426 that we asked for. Um, the the ask also in Paris was not just for emergency assistance, it was also for basic services to help make sure that we're doing what we can in terms of education, water, electricity, healthcare, etc., etc. I think everyone that we, our interlocutors, donors, others, one of the points that we've been trying to make to them is that Lebanon today is, or in the last year, since October 8th last year, etc., but is certainly not the Lebanon that was there in 2006. The last 5 years have had such an impact that people don't have the cushion. They don't have that. And the institutions themselves are very weak. The government is very weak, and that's there are a whole set of reasons that go into it, but certainly it's the multiplicity of crises that you've had since 2019. And so what we've also been trying to do in this response right now, and it comes back actually, one of my main counterparts has been Minister Yassin, in terms of trying to ensure that what we are doing is extremely well coordinated and collaborative between the government, between the UN, between NGOs, civil society, otherwise, some of the volunteers that have been working, some of the local organizations. And it has actually worked quite well to get an overall picture of, we, the UN, have been leading in terms of trying to ensure that there's full accounting and transparency regarding all funding that's been coming in for this emergency. And the government, of course, has received a lot of in-kind contributions. So they have a dashboard on that. I don't know if he spoke about it then, but it is good practice. It's extremely good practice that has happened at a time of crisis, of emergency. And what's key for us right now is to make sure we don't lose it as we come out of it and as we move to a different phase. And the phase we're in right now is still, I must sort of emphasize, still very humanitarian. There are needs in terms of winter now over here, in terms of shelter and fuel and heating and blankets and the like. It's going to people have been unsheltered for quite some time.
Thank you. So actually then, and one question has already popped up on this is how is aid being tracked? Now, when we had Minister Yassin on, he spoke about the dashboard. It was still not yet fully functioning, but I've seen it since. But I understood that it was mostly for the in-kind aid that was coming from various countries, the Gulf and so on. And UN is more takes the lead on tracking the financial aid. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that to our audience, to how that tracking is going now that we're 2 months into the since it started.
Yeah, I think your question actually about where are the pledges that were made in Paris reflects the complexity of this, because you have pledges made often, and some of them relate to already committed money, some of them relate to new money, etc. So there's quite a bit of legwork that's involved in trying to really confirm what funding has come in. When we have that funding, then it's relatively easy. It is what we are presenting and what we're providing primarily to donors and obviously to the government as well, is a breakdown of what funds have been received, which sectors they've been then spent on, right? Whether health or education or wash, water and sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. So there is very regular reporting on it. It used to be done on a quarterly basis. Now we're doing it pretty much every 2 weeks because we are in this emergency situation. What we also have to do a great deal of these days is trying to find the flexibility. As I said before, 14 days ago, we completely, at least geographically, had to think differently about where we're assisting and how we're assisting on that. So this is, and much of this at a certain point becomes public. It gets posted on our websites regarding whatever the main frameworks are that are used for assistance. So the LRP, the Lebanon Recovery Plan, for example, is one that will have exactly all of this quite public. What you were talking about in terms of the dashboard on the in-kind, also we hope will become easily accessible and visible. That is the point of trying to make sure that there's transparency and accountability in the assistance that's being provided. And that's been a key element that donors have been asking for quite some time.
Okay, still on this topic, Imran, of humanitarian, can you say something about the efforts to coordinate the NGOs? Who's doing that? How is it going? I mean, even some of the funds that are coming through the appeal, they might go to a UN agency, a specialized agency like UNICEF or what have you, and then some of that is granted to NGOs to do the actual implementation. So who's coordinating all of that?
There used to be, after the Beirut blast, there was in 2020. After that, there was an emergency response plan that was set up. There was a different framework, in a sense, that was used to respond to a lot of the needs that came out of that. Before that, there was something, and through that whole period, there was something called, that you are very familiar with, but I'm sure our audience is not. But what was a humanitarian and stabilization plan that was dealing mostly with the impact, not just assisting Syrian refugees, but the impact of Syrian refugees on the country. So helping institutions that were dealing with that, helping host communities and the like. What it led to also having a couple of different frameworks and different coordination structures was quite complicated at a certain point. So what we've done is try to put everything together and make it very clear. And in fact, the larger plan, the LCRP that I was talking about, what has happened since 2019 onwards with that is that the number of Lebanese assisted in it has grown massively. Right, so the proportions have changed a great deal, reflecting the vulnerability, the growing vulnerability of Lebanese in the country. So it's through this coordination structure, which is basically headed by me, that we, and co-chaired with the Prime Minister, the LRP, we are what we are trying to do is have a one coordination structure that has all the NGOs that work with us. Now, when you say all the NGOs, here I'm talking about those that belong to the consortia that are with us and that go out on, for example, appeals for funds, etc., with us, together with us. So, and what we try to do is that each sector in that, so health or education or water and sanitation, is co-led by someone from the UN, someone from an agency generally, someone from an NGO, and of course government representation as well. And there it's the Ministry of Social Affairs and the line ministries, the other line ministries that play quite an important role in it. So those NGOs that are part of that, and those are hundreds of international NGOs as well as national NGOs, are very much part of this one coordination structure and work, meaning in part of one plan in terms of response.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on a little bit to what hopefully we will get into, or Lebanon will get into, is a reconstruction phase, or recovery and reconstruction, reform, everything in that. And let me let's dig a little bit into this. First, in terms of estimates of the reconstruction, there's varying estimates, but I believe there hasn't been a comprehensive analysis assessment done. Usually that's done jointly with UN and World Bank and EU, and I would like to hear if there is confirmation of plans to do that and maybe a timetable for that. But in any case, I suppose the needs are going to be, the numbers are going to be big, and a few, a few $billions and the like. So where do you see these funds might come from, given first competition for funds globally, and now especially with neighboring Syria, or potentially with neighboring Syria, and then given the little political capital, unfortunately, that Lebanon has with many countries, especially its traditional funders like the GCC. So give me some of your ideas or your responses on that.
Sounds like a rhetorical question. Okay. First of all, on the rapid damage needs assessment process that is always done after a crisis, natural disasters and the like, as well as conflicts. As you were saying, it is done jointly by the European Union, the EU, set up here it would be, and the World Bank and the UN. And the UN meaning all the key agencies, of course, involved in it as well. So we're finalizing the terms of reference of what we would expect in an RDNA here. And an RDNA, of course, also works very much with the government. In terms of timeline, to try to launch the process, we're going to have discussions with the government, I think, in the coming immediate period. We have the relevant World Bank colleague hopefully coming back in a few days, and we will have a meeting with and try and finalize how we go ahead with that. So certainly, I mean, as you know, there was a cabinet meeting in Tyre last Saturday where there was discussion about reconstruction, recovery, where there was discussion about debris removal in particular. And for us, it's important that that we get the proper assessment as quickly as possible. So, and with all the relevant partners involved, which means also, the National Council for Scientific Research, CNRS, and because you do have some very, very effective, good, relatively small, and in many cases women-led national institutions that have done very good work tracking what's been happening and sort of trying to weigh on this. So we will be working with all of that quickly. Now, what I meant about your rhetorical question, yes, we're in a situation of real difficulty in mobilizing resources, and it is about different emergencies around the world, Ukraine and Sudan, and now in the neighborhood, Syria. very much so. And that pulls away from humanitarian assistance. The issue of development assistance, which is where we're going with this, which is where the billions that you're talking about, in a sense, are, is, as we know, for quite some time, been an issue of also trying to make sure that certain reforms take place and that there's certain safeguarding in the sense of how it goes ahead. So what we need to do is make sure that we have the proper sort of dialogue, the proper sort of consultation on how we go ahead. And that means not just simply between the UN and the government, or between donors and the government, but civil society has to play, I think, a very important role in this, given the types of crises that have happened before, and given why how that's led to this current sort of situation in not the crisis, but the lack of capital, in a sense, that you were talking about, that exists at this point. The 3RF, the Recovery, Reconstruction and Reform framework that was set up very much with the World Bank and with the EU and the UN after the Beirut blast, is a mechanism that I don't think has been used to its potential yet. There have been very good discussions there on all these areas of reform that need to take place. So I think that's something that we would like to go back to ensure that we're moving in the proper directions, and that you have the right sort of agreement between different stakeholders that something is being done in a reform-oriented manner. Clearly, one of the other elements that is probably the biggest element in all of this is, we're still in a situation without a president and with a caretaker government. The hope is, of course, that on the 9th of January, you'll have a president, and that will move very quickly. But that's certainly something that a lot of donors will also be looking at. How to mobilize and ensure the political will that's necessary to move towards reforms.
Indeed. In fact, I mean, I do hear this from separate donors that it cannot be an international conference for Lebanon until there's a new president and government and the like. I don't know if this is also UN view, but assuming if it's January 9th, then we're very close. But in the event the Lebanese mess it up and things get delayed, how would that affect having an international conference for Lebanon?
I don't know. I mean, the UN view in it obviously is that right now we need to be mobilizing what we can to assist those people that are most in need, right? And that is much more talking about recovery, early recovery, in a sense, doing what you can about livelihoods and the like, even in areas of displacement, even if people have not got back to their homes where they're displaced, what they can do, how we can sort of come up with programs that help them there, as well as, to the extent that we can, try to help SMEs and the like, sort of a lot of microcredit, a lot of all of that. I think a lot of that can happen, and certainly UNDP has already been working in that form. The big stuff is, I mean, for us, it's always, we're available. We can work on helping with electoral reforms, with administrative reforms, with helping on policy, with helping with all of this. But you need a proper structure that is functional in that way. I don't want to take away at all from the incredibly impressive work that a lot of our governmental counterparts have done in dealing with this crisis over this last period. But what we're talking about is what preceded that crisis, and those elements that need to be dealt with, because as you know, the call for reform from particular member states, from donors, has been quite strong. There are strategies. There are plans that have been worked out. I mean, there's actually been quite a bit of progress on social protection, on a social protection plan. So now, I mean, there are elements that you can work on. There are, and that needs, it goes back to what I was talking about before. You need a forum like the 3RF where you agree that something should be done or should not be done or is ripe to be done at a particular time. So I think that's the way that we'll be moving in the interim. And we hope, of course, that there's a president on the 9th.
And just for our audience, I think the 3RF, the main difference from maybe other structures that were set up in terms of aid coordination for Lebanon is that this was government, international organizations, UN and EU and World Bank and the like, but also civil society. They had a fundamental role there, both in oversight as well as, right?
Yeah,
This is what I think is what you're referring to as
yeah. And you
potentially
brought,
something to build on.
yes, and it also brought in, for example, members of parliament and private sector and other, think tanks and other entities into the, broad civil society in that sense. So the potential is there, and there have been extremely good discussions, for example, on justice reform in it. Whether they've reached where they need to yet or not, but at least it's setting. It's not wasting time. It's setting priorities in a certain way.
Right. So, I mean, I think this is going to be key in terms of reconstruction. One, of course, is to get the assessment done and the like. Second element would be the reforms that might be attached, or should be attached, to such a recovery plan, whether they're macro reforms, bringing back the IMF and slightly different, tweaked IMF plan, what have you, but also sectoral reforms. And then thirdly, financing, which we've talked about. And then fourth is going to be the implementation mechanism. This is going to be fundamental. This, in a way, that's where the cookie crumbles typically in Lebanon. So what are some of the ideas on implementation? Again, I mean, the traditional, on the one hand, I think most people would be sympathetic that government needs to lead and implement, but popular trust in these traditional government structures is not very high. So how are we going to balance this?
I mean, at the moment, I think in the immediate term, what we're trying to, and it goes back to sort of talking more about early recovery rather than reconstruction and the billions for reconstruction. In the immediate term, it's more about small entrepreneurs and medium-sized entrepreneurs and trying to, because it is the private sector that's going to play such an important role. It always does in this. So a lot of what we are trying to move towards is, I mean, we had the Productive Sector Development Program, something that we were running. It concluded, it was with Canadian funding and concluded recently, but it brought different agencies together, and it was agro-food and the like, and trying to also work with an export academy and using UNIDO for different markets and the like. So I think there's a lot that can be done with that, and there the implementation becomes much more through international organizations, but also through NGOs. And there has been very good work even throughout this whole period in that sense. So I think that's immediate. I think the role of the diaspora is key, and it's key both in terms of advocacy and talking about what should be done and what should not be done as we go ahead, but also supporting, mentoring. What needs to be reversed at this point is the complete lack of confidence that's been here for a number of years, and it's quite understandable. So the brain drain, the aspiration of every young person to go and become part of the diaspora rather than being here and contributing here. But I think the contributions that the diaspora have already been making are huge. We know that during the whole financial crisis, during those whole 4 or 5 years, what's been happening. So I think I'm very happy to have this discussion today, in a sense, because I do think we need to share with you some of our mechanisms. We have pooled funds that are more focused on recovery. We have something called the Lebanon Humanitarian Fund. We're about to make a allocation that will be about $30 million from the next allocation. So it's not a small amount in the current sort of situation. And all of that goes to NGOs. All of that, the LHF money goes, it goes probably to about 60%, a little less than 60% international NGOs right now with this allocation, and over 40% to national NGOs. And of course, international ones work with national as subcontracting, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot about supporting that approach, a very localized approach over here. Mainly it's governmental donors that give to it, but also we have some private donors that give to it as well. So it has a very interesting advisory board that is quite inclusive and tries to ensure all those elements that you were talking about before, about transparency and accountability, and impact, and very much impact. So these funds are key mechanisms, key tools that we have to try to ensure accountable, transparent, relevant assistance and interventions at this time.
But in terms of government institutions in a reconstruction phase, I mean, I think we all want that. We want government institutions to play a bigger role, to play their role. But there isn't a lot of public confidence in their ability. The Council of the South and a few others, I don't have to name them, but which have not had a great track record. How are we going to go about, working with them?
Some of that is you know, it's too soon, because we haven't done the overall needs assessment, and we haven't defined the approach, and the approach has to be defined by the government on this, and then we have to see how we go ahead, and whether the resources will come and what we do with it at that point. But in the interim, what you do have is, you know, you have different things that have been worked on: the digital transformation strategy, the national anti-corruption strategy. You've got I was mentioning a lot of the work that we did with Minister Yassin on this crisis, and the way that we were responding, and the mechanisms that we were trying to use for transparency and accountability in it. So I think that's why the discussion amongst all the stakeholders together becomes important, because I think that can help guide us in directions where we do think we can get the reform, where we do think we can get that level of transparency and accountability. So it's going to have to be a bit of going quickly, but step by step in that way. I'm not going to be able to really say anything significant about the mechanisms for reconstruction at this point, because it's not yet very clear on that.
Okay, thank you. Let me pick up a question from the audience. Roy Eid is asking, now that the war is over in Syria, is the UN going to keep giving money to the Syrian refugees in Lebanon? Probably expected that question.
Yeah. No, look, even before the developments of last weekend, which were, of course, incredibly historic and dramatic, and I think none of us expected it to happen so quickly and at this time. In hindsight, you see how hollow certain things were. and how things and how perfect the configuration was in a certain way. But so none of us expected that in that way. But what the point I'm trying to make with this is, even before this huge change in Syria, the UN was thinking very differently in terms of assistance to Syrians. The High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, was here maybe a month and a half ago, more or less a month and a half ago, and we were in meetings with a lot of Lebanese counterparts, including the Prime Minister, and we're discussing exactly that issue. And things that he has said on record and publicly is about trying to give assistance to those who voluntarily repatriate in Syria in a way that wasn't being done before. We kept talking about early recovery. We kept talking about having more of that, because you need schools, you need basic services. People need to be able to have the basics in that way. But also there was this imbalance that people perceived of there being cash assistance being given to people in a refugee context, whereas not in a returnee context. So that was anyway changing at that point, before all of this. Now, as people want to go back, of course, it's their right to go back, and we have to help them go back. And what we have to be doing right now is also really soliciting the funding to assist in Syria, because I mean, I think everyone should understand that however bad the situation has been and became in Lebanon, it's nowhere near as bad as it was in Syria, which is why you do have a lot of the inflow that you've had on this. But right now, it's a remarkable change, and it will certainly, I think, let's hope that it moves in the right direction. I think we have to be a bit cautious, but also optimistic and hopeful, and try to make the right interventions with those that are in power to try to ensure that it goes in the right way. So far, the statements that have been made, the rhetoric, the actions so far seem to have been very good, very positive. So it is high time, after 14 years of incredible tragedy and misery and suffering, to really try to turn that page. And hopefully what you get is instead a competition on reconstruction in both spaces, and where the labor is going to be for reconstruction.
Right, right. No, I mean, I remember from my own World Bank days, so many reports and papers we wrote about reconstruction of Lebanon and Syria, or what Syrian reconstruction, how that will affect Lebanon. And now it's time to dust these off, I hope, and really go for a win-win. But you know Syria very well, actually, so this is you're in a good place now because I think one of the key questions will be, how is Syria, what's happening in Syria? And of course, there are different scenarios as to how it will pan out, but how this will affect Lebanon. One of them is going to be in terms of the labor market. Obviously, if massive amount of refugees return, there very well might be labor shortages in Lebanon. And
especially if you have a lot of reconstruction happening. If you do get that happening there, then, I mean, we always say this, and we know this, and I think everyone knows that we saw it just here in terms of internally displaced persons in Lebanon. If people can be home and have a decent life at home, that's where they want to be. If they can sustain their families, if they can do that is so. It is, hopefully that's what we'll get, but not in a way that also negatively, impacts economies here and there. But I mean, if there is a big reconstruction happening there, certainly that'll also be an economic boom to Lebanon, I think.
I want to ask you a little bit about human capital or education. Obviously, that's key to rebuild a new Lebanon. And Lebanon has had a big loss of human capital over the past few years. It's actually been measured by the World Bank and other agencies. And that's a lot of it has to do with the closures of schools, the COVID, what have you, and also very large brain drain. So, what are your ideas about how Lebanon can rebuild its human capital?
Well, it's certainly. I mean, first and foremost is education at every level, right? And I'm very happy, as I was mentioning earlier, to see your appeal and your fund to work on this, because there has been, I mean, such a loss in learning over all of these years. So you have, the lack of confidence in people trying to leave, and certainly all of those that can and are skilled and are educated are more of a chance. You are creating a lot more inequality at this time, also because of the lack of education in this, and those that can and those that can't. So education is a key, and that's something that we can do something about quite immediately. And even in the context of the current crisis, and getting the schools back, and making sure that everyone is enrolled and being taught. But then it's also about looking at opportunities, right? And it goes back to working with the creating livelihoods, labor market interventions in that. And there, I think, again, you have this remarkable diaspora from Lebanon, and you have a relatively small country. I mean, if you look at all the different, sort of relationships of diasporas to their countries, et cetera, here you have a very strong relationship, and that can make quite an impact. So there are, I think, interesting ways of engaging. I personally don't know what programs you have right now that try and facilitate that, but certainly with the UN, we've got a number of programs. UNDP, UN Women, the others have programs on women in business and small business. We've got a young leadership program that UNDP runs. There are a number, and certainly I can send those to you, and you can share them, because they're ones I think that one can engage with in this sense. It is fundamentally to try to give people hope in doing something over here. And it's not just hope, it's practically giving them the potential. And I think it is happening. I've been so basically absorbed with this crisis for the last year, and all of these other emergencies, that I haven't been able to really gauge what is happening in that sense, because one does always get surprised by how creative and innovative certain things are over here. And so that actually needs to be encouraged, I think, as much as possible. The yeah.
There's a couple of other questions coming in. Yahdate is saying, are there plans to deploy support in more efficient manner, learning from your agency track record of partnership to date across multiple sectors? I guess the question about more efficient work, because somebody's also asking about high overheads and coordination between international organizations and NGOs.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the in terms of within Lebanon, the first step that we took was trying to make sure that we were rationalizing these frameworks and coordination structures, and doing that both at a national and a subnational level. So coming up with merging two frameworks and having one Lebanon response plan at this point, the LRP, was that a lot of it had to do with that. It had to do with these funds that I was talking about before, the LHF and the LRF, the Humanitarian Fund and the Recovery Fund, what we try to do in those as well is make sure that we have very low overheads in the recovery, and we have joint programs. We have different parts of the UN, for example, but also with NGOs, bringing different mandates and skills and expertise to that and putting them together, which leads to much more impact in a much more efficient manner. So we've been trying to do different aspects of that within Lebanon. At the same time, I think there's a lot of recognition that some of the global aid architecture, the global humanitarian architecture, has become very complicated and very heavy in a lot of ways. And some of you may have seen this in the news or not, but we have a new overall head of humanitarian, our crisis chief. Is in fact, some of you may recognize his name from earlier here. He was the British ambassador here, I think around 2011 to 14, Tom Fletcher. So Tom Fletcher
the head of OCHA, UN
is
OCHA.
now become the head of OCHA, the head of humanitarian. And one of the first things he said when he came in is that the architecture needs to be looked at and that we need to simplify as much as possible because it's got really quite complicated. And he asked one of his predecessors, who's now the head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jan Egeland, to lead on this. So, so to the question, yes, you're right. We need to be doing more of this. We've been trying to do what we can here in Lebanon, just amongst ourselves and an understanding between ourselves, NGOs, donors, UN agencies, trying to move this in this direction. But it has to also happen at a global level, given the various bureaucracies we're all part of.
Absolutely. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about social cohesion in Lebanon, especially during this period when the displacement was happening. We heard anecdotally, and different people have different experiences, but that there were many, I mean, most communities obviously were very welcoming. And there was a beginning of work at the local level, at the schools and the shelters to bring the communities together, better understanding. I mean, what is your kind of assessment on this? And was it a good experience? Is something coming out of this that we can build on? Because this was quite dramatic, bringing people from, the south to north to east, west. I mean,
yeah, and I think it was mixed. I think you saw some incredibly positive, good things. And you also saw some situations where there was, especially at one point when a lot of the airstrikes were expanding and hitting displaced people in their places of displacement, and targeting more, not so much individuals as we saw in a lot of this, but basically communities in a sense, and it seemed like that, or at least that was the perception at a certain point. I was up in Akkar at a francophone school that was being used both. It was about to open it was just before the school year was supposed to start. But half of it was being used as a shelter and half of it was as a school. And the IDPs there were somewhere from deep south and somewhere were from Dahia. And it was amazing looking at the interaction. I think people were learning a lot about each other at that point. And it was really heartening. It was very nice to see. So I think there has been a fair amount of this in this. Our own interventions, where possible, try to bring those that are displaced and some benefit to those that are hosting them as well. Try and get people to do projects together and the like. So a lot of the agencies started doing things like that. Getting people jointly to knit clothes for babies and you know, a lot of these little initiatives like that. But fundamentally, I think there was a lot of worry about tension between communities, and also a recognition. We haven't talked about that, but a recognition that this is, you know, when we are coming out of this, when as Lebanon is coming out of this and moving, a lot of it is also about ensuring that we go back to that Lebanon goes back to a lot of former agreements about how things should go, and making sure that it is inclusive as it moves forward. And that, I think, is going to be a huge element of that. Again, it's about looking more at where there's commonality than difference in these things. And I think in today's world, we've seen how damaging concentrating on the difference has been in so many different situations. And again, you have such incredible talent that one sees, and drive and innovation and all of these sorts of things, and it's very well recognized globally, but it's recognized more outside of Lebanon than inside of Lebanon. So
Where
that's
it works better
related.
outside than inside. Yeah.
So I think it does come back to now, I think, practically trying to make sure that the programs that are going ahead, and the immediate ones, I think, in the next 3, 4, 5 months, before, I don't know at what point we get to the billions and the big reconstruction and all of that that's happening, but I have a feeling that a lot will need to change between now and the way things are done to get to those billions. I mean, that we've heard from lots of different key stakeholders in this. But at the same time, what we cannot allow right now is for institutions to get weaker. They've got very weak. If you're working, if you really want to help affected people, you also need to make sure that you've got municipalities that can work with them as well. You need to make sure that water is there. You need to make sure that solid waste is being removed. We need to make sure that all of these things are happening. And to do that, you need that sort of partnership.
No, absolutely. Okay, we've reached the end of our hour, Imran, but I just want to ask you lastly, I mean, are you optimistic about the future for Lebanon and for the region? You've been around a long time in this region.
I think, I mean, look, my experience over this last crisis, working together with all the counterparts, has been actually quite positive. I've seen a lot of really good things happening. So what we need to ensure is that we don't lose that, and that we continue with that. I think and it's not up to us. We all know that. We know the geopolitics of the situation. I do think there is an interest in trying to ensure that we are getting beyond what has happened over the last 14 months over here. Now, there's a big unknown also coming up in all of this. I mean, we don't know how some of the key actors will be acting in a couple of months from now. There is a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities right now that is, I think, despite what we've seen over the last 2 weeks, is something where there is some commitment to it. And so we're hoping that that's sustainable. We're hoping that gives that. What happened in Syria is phenomenal. is really phenomenal, and it was extremely unexpected that it would happen right now, and in the manner that it happened. So that hopefully will go in a positive direction. I mean, so far, what we've heard is not bad at all. It's quite so. But we also know, and you know this extremely well, how complex Syria is, and so it's not going to be just up to Syria, as it is not just up to Lebanon, but it's going to be some of the other players in all of this that are going to have to also allow the space for something to happen.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you very much, Imran, for these words. And there's a few other questions we didn't get to, but we will try to help answer them offline. One of them is to actually, if you can provide the information on some of the projects you mentioned.
Can I
I
do that
suppose.
through you? Yeah,
Yes,
through you.
absolutely.
Or,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, yeah.
So I'll
Just
do
provide
that
the.
and give you a focal point that you can also share with on these issues, on these
Yeah,
projects.
thank
Um,
you.
and maybe at some point we can actually have something much more technical on some of the things that are going on in one of your future ones.
Great. Thank you so much, Imran. And thank you very much for everyone for joining. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.